Welcome to Journals of Self-Discovery. Hello everyone. My guest for today's episode is Michael Taft. Michael was introduced to me by my wife Amy, and I was so impressed that not only did I decide to interview him, but he is participating in a retreat that we are holding March 3rd through the 5th. You can learn more about that by going to poetryinmotionfilms.com and looking for the March retreat link at the top of the page. Michael has over 30 years of meditation experience, and as you'll see in the interview, he was able to quickly and clearly explain a different approach to what I consider one of the toughest conundrums in meditation, that of awareness watching awareness. I hope you enjoy this interview with Michael Taft, and please check out the show notes at spiritualteachers.org/podcast. Well, Michael, thanks for joining me this morning. I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule.
Happy to be here, Sean.
I've read a little bit of your book, The Mindful Geek. I've watched, you have a few videos available on YouTube. I've taken a look at those, and I think I've actually been to your meditation class one or two times. I know one of the questions that jumped into my mind from reading The Mindful Geek is you mentioned just a little bit about your background, your history. And I'm curious, really a little bit of the story of how you got interested in meditation, how your life took a turn down that path.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I was raised in a family where, even though we were nominally Christian, my mom was actually interested in a lot of alternative religious stuff. She didn't really practice it as such, but she was very, very open to the ideas of, different religions or different understandings of Christianity. And so it was always very eclectic and kind of an atmosphere of openness around spirituality. It was also, there was some difficulties in childhood and in my teenage years that caused me to have a really bad trouble with anxiety. I was having crippling anxiety attacks. I'd spent a lot of time in my room, just basically frozen in terror, and I needed to do something about that. It was a big problem, and I didn't really, this was in Michigan, this is in the 70s, there just wasn't that much help available. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know how to ask for help anyway, even if it had been. So the one thing I knew about, in quotes, was meditation, and I hadn't done any. And I didn't, at that point, I didn't know any teachers, and I didn't know how to find any teachers. You have to picture a pre-internet world. Right. And also, at that time, there probably were very few, even though I was in, Lansing. So the Michigan State University is there, and there's, potentially there was people who knew, but I didn't know how to find them. But I knew it existed. And so I just started working on that myself. Like I tried to find books that could tell me something about how to do it. And then I started practicing in a very rudimentary way, sort of how any kid might try to do something out of a book. Mm-hmm. And I think basically what I was doing initially was something along the lines of course, they wouldn't have called it this, or I wouldn't have known it was called this, but something, looking back, something along the lines of a yoga nidra visualization thing. Visualizing parts of your body relaxing and so on. And I also just took a look at my own experience, and I just had this very kind of natural, inquisitive experience around my own anxiety. And it sounds kind of like a obvious point now these days, but back then, to me, it was a blinding revelation where I realized, every time I have an anxiety attack, it's because I'm thinking about what's going to happen in a week and a month and 6 months and a year. Mm-hmm. And what if I just didn't allow myself to do that? What if I only allowed myself to think about the very next actions I have to take for, let's say, tomorrow? What do I have to get done for tomorrow? And then if I try to think beyond that, I'll just stop myself. And that was actually a big deal, because that sort of jammed the mechanism of anxiety so it couldn't work. It made it so it was very, very hard to, I might be worried about tomorrow, but I wasn't having an anxiety attack about tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And so that really, that combined with doing these meditative visualizations on relaxation, where you would kind of visualize, let's say, warm light filling your right hand and each finger, and then warm light in your palm of your hand, and, like that, and do it for your whole body, which I must have read out of some paperback somewhere. That stuff together really worked. Mm-hmm. It really helped me. And I stopped having bad anxiety attacks. And then from there, I was sold. I did, when I went to college, I started doing yoga, and I found actual meditation teachers. And, pain relief is a big motivator. Pain is a big motivator, and pain relief really gets your attention. And so I was hooked. I was very into it, and have been ever since.
Mm-hmm. Now, was there a point in time for you that, well, for example, a person can be in pain and find something that alleviates that pain, and then they're fine with that, and they stop there in terms of meditation practice, let's say. Well, in your experience, it seems like you kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it. At some point, would you say that the anxiety and so forth and the pain wasn't really what was driving you anymore in your meditation, the relief from that?
Yeah, I would say that even though I did get a lot of relief from that, and it was it wasn't manifesting in the form of these intense anxiety attacks or these other super difficult emotions, that I was doing enough deep work that I kept finding new layers of anxiety, or new layers of difficult emotion, or new layers of suffering, further and further down in there. Not that I was looking for them or trying to find it, but because I was doing practices that were very awakening oriented, it keeps kind of jamming your nose into the stuff that's not awakened. Mm. And so it certainly was motivational. I think, however, the biggest experience also at college was of experimenting with entheogenic compounds, mm-hmm. which really opened things up at a dramatic level for me. So that took what was a good, solid practice and kind of ripped the top off of it and made it so I realized I really could go quite a bit deeper than I had ever imagined. And so it was very inspiring to do that, and to realized that in my meditation I could find similar depth and openness and experience on my own without any support.
Another person might have just kept experimenting with the hallucinogens or whatever in particular it was, and have gone down that path. Yet for yourself, it sounds like you went down the path of meditation instead. Did you have a sense, or did you have advice from someone that, meditation is actually the more powerful practice or the most efficient way to get what you were after?
Sure. I mean, by this time, we're talking years later in college and so on. I'm a big reader, and I was taking, religious courses. I remember my professor way back then, we're talking in the early 80s, my professor was Paul Muller-Ortega, who has since become a luminary in the Shaivite Hindu tradition in America. Very well-known guy. And, I was going to every sort of different meditation experience, whether it was Zen or Hindu or even like New Age stuff. And so, there was a lot of people who were like, yeah, this practice will get you what you're looking for, and it will get you there on your own. It's fine that you sort of have opened this door with these experiments, but now you want to be able to walk through the door on your own. And I thought that made perfect sense. And was very highly motivated. I was really into it, and ended up going and working and teaching in Japan for several years, and doing martial arts really intensely. And that gave me a lot more space and time to be meditating. And so I put in a lot of time there. And, it just gets more and more and more interesting. And I was more and more fascinated by every aspect of it. I never did really settle on one particular teacher or one particular tradition, although I, have definite favorites that I've spent decades with. I wouldn't say that I approach this from the perspective of getting involved in some kind of religion. I've always been interested in awakening and love and freedom, not a particular path.
And who are some of your favorite teachers?
Well, that I've actually worked with, I really spent quite a bit of time working with a woman Hindu guru named Anandi Ma Patak. She is quite young and lives in California still. And her teacher was a ancient sadhu, a wandering, broke spiritual seeker named Dhyan Yogi, very unusual moniker, Dhyan Yogi, Madhusudan Dasji. Madhusudan Dasji is real normal name, but Dhyan Yogi is this unusual sobriquet. In any case, I went and worked with him over in India, and this is someone who was like well over 100, and this is straight up Hindu Tantrism, large emphasis on Kundalini, on mantras, on yoga, on pranayama, on ritual purity, worship of various deities, and so on. So that was actually the only thing I found that was as truly powerful in terms of just plain experiences and going deep as my experience in college had been. So I really trusted that path because it was it was quite clear to me that the practices did what they said on the box. If they told me that this was going to have such and such an effect, very often it had exactly that effect. And so I really loved working with them, and I still work with them to some extent, and spent a lot of time in India and fully involved in Hindu practice. So that was just beyond wonderful for me. I loved that, and still, like I say, still do some of that. And during that time, I started working at Sounds True as the editorial director, which means I had a unique opportunity to bring people in to the company to record. I could find new authors. I could find pretty much any teacher I wanted and bring them in. So I had this huge exposure to every different kind of tradition. And when these people would, when the authors would arrive and work with us, they might stay for 3 days or even a week. And so I got to spend quite a bit of time producing their programs, talking to them at great length, understanding their thinking. And it just was interesting because I noticed that, who was acting how privately and who seemed to have something really going on and who didn't. And, this was just my personal judgment about that, but I felt like it was really fascinating who seemed to buy their own spiel, and,
right,
and who seemed to actually know what they were talking about. And of all those people, for me, the most fascinating, and a lot of them were very fascinating, but the one who resonated for me the most was Shinzen Young, for a whole bunch of reasons. But I think the main reason was he seemed to be coming from a perspective of really, having experience and knowing what he was talking about, but also because he was as eclectic and world-traveled and exposed to all these different traditions as I was. So he could talk to all those different viewpoints on meditation and viewpoints on spirituality as I could. So I felt like here's someone who actually isn't just, totally involved in the viewpoint of their one tradition and only able to speak to spiritual experience from one tradition, and understands that it's important to look at this stuff in the original languages if you can, and it's important to understand the historical perspective and so on. To me, that was just very refreshing. And so I started working with Shinzen and still do. So those are probably the two biggest and most, the people who I've spent the most time learning from and practicing with, although I've learned and practiced with many others.
Just as a side note, did you study audio engineering or something like that in college? How did you land that sweet job at Sounds True?
I've just always been interested in recording. As a kid, I would record programs on like a cassette tape deck, like not even a deck, like just picture like the world's crummiest cassette recorder from the 60s. Mm-hmm. And but even back then, I was figuring out how to make programs. Like we would think of all these ways to do multi-tracking, even though we didn't even know what multi-tracking was, but we figured out that if you got two recorders, you could record something on one and then play that while you recorded something on the other, and you would get 2 tracks on there, and then you could play that out loud and record on the first tape deck again, and now you'd have 3 tracks. Mm-hmm. So that was even as children. And so there's just always been this deep interest. And then when I lived in Japan, I was exposed to a lot of technology that I just wasn't seeing in the States. In college, we did a lot of bouncing back and forth between bigger tape decks, but still multi-tracking in that way. But when I was in Japan, I was making good money and had very low expenses, and ended up buying a Tascam 4-track recorder. And that was just like kid in a candy store. I just spent endless hours and days and months recording and multi-tracking over and over and over. So by the time I came back to the States, I was, let's say, highly conversant in recording, and from a lay perspective. And also, I had a big background in what amounts to world mystical traditions, because I was endlessly reading. And I'd also had some very extreme awakening experiences. And so it's funny, I did not land the job at Sounds True because I was a recording person at all. I landed the job because I was walking around Boulder and saw that there was a angel on the door. That, I don't know if you've seen the old Sounds True logo from 30 years ago, but there was an angel, and I just saw that angel on the door, and I was like, well, that's where I want to work. And I walked in and got hired to ship boxes. Oh. And back then, Tammy hired everyone herself. So Tammy and her partner, Devin. So I went into their office, and they asked me a few questions. And I was like, yeah, well, I can ship boxes for you. It's not going to be hard. And so I just was working in the shipping department. But then there was an opening in the office to work on writing. And I've always been a good writer, so I auditioned for that, and they were totally, utterly skeptical. But I got it, and then just worked my way up from there.
Wow, great story.
Yeah, it was fun. Back then, there was only something like 12 or 13 people in the company, and it was just great.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you ever feel any conflict between, let's say, the path of tradition and what some people might think is more of an American approach or Western approach of, well, I'm going to pick the best from all these different traditions and assemble my own path? Did you ever feel like maybe you were missing out, or why didn't you say, well, I'm gonna follow this Hindu teacher, I'm gonna do exactly what they say because eventually that's gonna get me what I want?
Well, I actually did do that for let's say a number of years. Mm-hmm. It was like, well, I'm going to just do this and concentrate on it and do exactly what they say. And I ended up getting, involved in a celibate marriage and being essentially a lay monk for years, doing really serious Hindu practice. This is not what's available at your local, yoga center. This is
gotcha.
Food rules and all kinds of really crazy, intense stuff. And so I really did put singular effort on that for a long time, mainly because I had just hung out with the teachers. These were not well-known teachers with millions of disciples or something. These were teachers that I could hang out with in their home, spend a tremendous amount of time working with them personally. And so I just loved it. I loved everything about it. I loved being in India when we were there. I loved the fact that everything was in Sanskrit. I just, for whatever reason, really like Sanskrit, and back then memorized endless verses and so on. So it's not like I was flitting carelessly from thing to thing.
Mm-hmm.
I like to dig into whatever I'm working on in Shinzen system as well. I spent many, many, many years basically doing only Shinzen type stuff, or almost only. And so I really like to go deep. And at the same time, it's just my bent of psychology or whatever. The internal contradictions of any system are something that eventually sort of bug me, and I want to work on the shadow areas. I want to work on the stuff that the system doesn't address or doesn't let you talk about, or there's always the case that you may be having experiences that system doesn't even address. So, to me, the places of overlap are interesting. Like there's, of course, aspects of spirituality and meditation and awakening that are the same in every tradition. So that's powerful and interesting and tells us something about human beings. But there's also all this stuff in each tradition that is completely unique, and that is where they've sort of worked on their one corner of awakening to the nth degree, and they've really, brought that out and kind of uncovered this one corner of things. And to me, that's even more fascinating. Like getting in there and sort of, in one way, like intellectually understanding what's unique about that tradition, but in practice, really touching that experience and that unique corner, and understanding that they're the ones who are really working on excavating that corner of things, if that makes any sense.
Could you give an example of, you mentioned the shadow or the shadow side. Can you give an example of that from something that you noticed in a tradition?
Yeah, so when I was in Japan, it was interesting because I was doing a lot of Zen meditation. I wasn't at a temple formally. I wasn't a monk, but I was going to temples and meditating in a lay practitioner way, and was getting a lot out of it. But I started having a lot of very intense energy experiences, a lot of physical energy, a lot of altered states, and especially as a lay practitioner, the Buddhist Zen way of dealing with that was, well, don't make a thing out of it. That's great. So you're having some experiences, just keep sitting. And, many years later, I see how that's good advice. Okay, that works. It's a reasonable reaction. But at the time, I was like, listen, this stuff is, blowing my mind. I'm having these very intense experiences. And as a lay practitioner, it's not like I'm in a monastery working with someone every day, or in the, protected, safe zone crucible atmosphere of a monastery. I'm out in the world, and I need to work with this stuff. This is intense. And, they just were not interested in that at all. That's not what they do. And so that's when I initially got interested in Hindu stuff, because they were willing to go right at it. That's the corner of, the vast universe of awakening. That's the part of it that they're really, especially this tradition I was working with, they're really interested and competent in and want to work with. So the fact that they were willing to talk to me about these experiences and give me tools to work with them effectively, to me was like, great, let's go there. you know.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always aspects of awakening that a tradition really emphasizes and sort of gives you pat on the back for having, and then there's aspects of experience that they don't like. So, and or either they don't like or they don't really go there. They don't know much about it. So, and the two things I often heard about that from the people in the tradition was either, well, we don't go there because it's not worth going there. The old, that's not really enlightenment, or that's not awakening, or that won't lead you to awakening, or that's
right.
not useful. So that's, one sort of reaction that you get. And another one is just, we don't know about that. Although even that is rare to hear. Mostly it's like that either, that's either bad, wrong, or not worth doing. People won't use those exact words, but that's the idea. Like, don't go there, and that's always been a sore point for me. I don't want to be told don't go there. I want someone to speak knowledgeably about that whole aspect of experience, and that's something that I try to bring into my own teaching these days. Is wherever somebody's coming from. And whatever kind of experience they're having, I try to meet them there, to speak their language and work with them in the way that they think is interesting. And sometimes people do have certain types of experiences that I know someone who can work with that better, and so I'll, point them in a different direction. But I'm never saying yeah, that's a bad direction, or that's not an interesting part of your mind or awakening. It's all fascinating. It's all interesting. And I really respect the fact that all these different lineages, all these different teachers and traditions have focused on different parts of it to bring it into high relief, and that we have that available to us. So I think, you use this phrase like American spirituality, trying to get the best of everything. And I would say, I wouldn't say that I'm looking for the best of everything, because that's just not how my psychology ended up unfolding. It's more like I want to know the whole territory of spirituality, or the whole territory of my mind. And so instead of being the best of everything, it's just more about wholeness and really understanding where different traditions are coming from and what they're working on, and having some actual experience in those directions. And so I feel like, having this kind of more complete map is really the name of the game for me, or has been the name of the game for me. I always liked the books about Sri Ramakrishna, the 19th century Indian mystic, because they would always emphasize how he had gotten awakened in something like, I think the number is 36 different traditions. So after his initial awakening, he then practiced in, he found, he was living at a temple as a priest. He found teachers of every different kind of tradition over many decades and had them teach him their best stuff. And so he ended up getting awakened in all these different ways. And in fact, the American teacher Lex Hixon, who I just loved, what an interesting, fun, brilliant guy, wrote that book called Great Swan. And he really emphasizes this aspect of Sri Ramakrishna's personality or awakening or whatever, that he could switch from mode to mode to mode, things that we would sort of traditionally considered to be entirely different styles of spirituality or entirely different paths to awakening, you could just switch between them effortlessly and talk from each of those places. Now, to me, that was, obviously he's a virtuoso of this, but that is something to be emulated. That, to me, is quite fascinating. And I find it, I don't know, maybe a little disappointing or frustrated when people insist that there is only one kind of awakening and only one way to be enlightened, and that even if there's many paths to get there, there's only this one thing that's interesting. So just as an example, Sri Ramakrishna was very devotional towards the Hindu goddess Kali.
Right.
And he was raised in a village in Bengal, so we're talking uneducated in a village in Bengal, so he had a very traditional religious viewpoint of just loving the goddess and doing his practices for her, and that was sort of his original initial awakening. And it's quite fascinating because even many years later, when he had learned complete non-dual thusness that denied all spirituality of any kind, and thought all practices were ridiculous, and he had mastered that, and could demonstrate to other people that he had mastered that, he said he still preferred to just come down from that and have an I-thou relationship with the goddess, because that love aspect and that worship aspect was so pleasing. And I just thought, God, that's so fascinating and interesting. It's, we always think that there's these levels and layers, and that certain enlightenments are better than others, and that everyone would always want the one that's better if they had it.
Right.
And it wasn't like he was avoiding, this more Advaita non-dual awakening. He would go there, but it's, in the end for him, it's just sort of like, he liked rock music instead of country music. He's like, well, I just prefer to worship the goddess. It feels great. And he wasn't insisting that everyone else should think that was the best thing. He would teach them all kinds of stuff. So it wasn't some kind of statement of what's better than another. And instead it was just he had sampled all these different ways, and not just sampled, but actually found awakening in, dozens and dozens of different paths. And that was the one that just worked for him. In terms of like his own personality. And I just thought I think that's great. I mean, there's things to criticize about Sri Ramakrishna and so on, but to me that's kind of an archetype of what is an interesting sort of awakened teacher to me, is someone who is just able to do it all and able to teach you how to do it all and interested in all of it. And not saying that one thing has to be considered better than another in some kind of absolute way, even if he has his own opinion about what he likes kind of personally.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there isn't an end to the spiritual path?
Absolutely not.
No?
Absolutely not. That it never stops. If you think you're at the end, you're more deluded than when you started. It's time to really examine your assumptions about what a human being is and what a human being's capable of, and what your goals are. Because, like I've said, no matter what awakening you have found, and I hope you found a lot of awakening, there's always other angles to come at that from, other, I don't mean other experiences necessarily, but other ways to come at awakening. And beyond that, there's other ways to grow as a human being. There's always more psychological work to do.
Yeah.
There's always more service to be involved with. There's always ways to work on unpacking your own shadow. So to me, anyone who is saying that they're somehow finished is just not aware of their own complacency or assumptions.
That seems to be I think that in itself seems to be a tradition, if you will, that there's the teacher, there's the guru, and they have attained something, and now they're done, and now they're going to tell other people about it or how they got to it, and give them advice about how they got to it, and so forth.
Sure, that can be a traditional attitude, but the traditional teachers I've worked with are very humble and are always continuously working on themselves and working on their awakening and working on finding those spots in themselves that are still stuck. Because this is what's so fascinating, right? You can have found a brilliant awakening, a deep, 100% valid awakening. And obviously, that's real good. But in a way, that can be like a window. It's like there's a window in the wall. And now, this is how I talk to my students who have found some level of awakening. I'm like, now your job is to make that window bigger and bigger. Because it's all you've done is like poked a hole.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of your life is about making that hole bigger. And there's no end to that. There's no final moment where it can't get any bigger. Because there's always some part of your own psychology or some part of your own behavior in the world that needs work, that needs some healing and some compassion and some awakening. So and so that you can help others, so that you can be more effective in the world. And it's the people who are surrounded by disciples who tell them that they're perfect, and people who believe that a teacher should be finished with the spiritual path and done with their job of awakening. It's those people who start really doing bad stuff, molesting their students, playing power games, all that kind of malfeasant behavior, because they are forced by the geometry of that situation to pretend they don't have any problems. And so their problems start to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually they're acting out in these terrible ways. And then you get their students who believe that the teacher must be perfect, then not giving them any corrective feedback. And so it just gets worse and worse. So to me, that whole idea, like that there can be a perfect master, that they can be finished, is just a recipe for disaster. Now, that doesn't mean that that people can't feel done. I mean, it's perfectly legitimate to be like, look, I found what I was looking for, and now I'm going to go, do something else. To me, that's a different question. It's not, that's different than saying like, I'm as enlightened as it's possible to be, and every part of my psychology is now perfect, and I'm just going to go be a perfect master.
Yeah.
That's different. It's legit to say, look, I woke up in this way that I wanted to, and now I'm going to go, learn to ski or something. Great. To me, that's different. It's very, very common to have a powerful awakening experience and to feel kind of done. Okay, that's what I wanted. Now I know what that is, and now I'm going to go do something else. That's a different matter entirely.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I don't know about you, but there was a core dissatisfaction or a core fear, really, in me that drove my spiritual search. And the resolution of that did bring a feeling of, oh, that's been answered. That's,
yeah,
wow, okay. But then I also see what you're saying, that, yeah, absolutely, there is no end to widening that window and widening one's ability to help another person and be a more true manifestation of whatever it is that a person awoke to.
Yeah, I mean, I relate to that entirely. There can be this kind of core neurotic quality or core anxiety or core issue that is driving you. It's at the base of all the seeking. And just like people say, once that's dissolved and once you become awake to what that really is, that's gone. And that motivation to practice to wake up from that, it disappears completely, right? It's just gone. And so it might be the case that for years, or even the rest of your life, you feel, okay, well, I'm done with that. What I found, however, is that, well, there's always another part of your psychology that it might not be that painful. It might not be driving your whole life, but, oh, interesting. There's another neurotic fixation. There's another stuck point. There's another way that I'm behaving in the world that is just not helpful. And so there's always that stuff to work on. And I feel like every day, just being a human being, more of those start to arise. And if you didn't keep practicing, there would be, or even if it's not practicing in the literal sense, even if you didn't keep on top of that, you'd start building up a new crust of neurotic problems. So to me, it's a lifelong thing that must be attended to and is pleasant to attend to, and especially with the kind of openness and sensitivity that you end up feeling. I feel like an obligation to other humans to just get better and better at this stuff. And by that, I don't mean to turn into some sort of bliss-ninny or person who only ever feels good.
Right.
I'm just not interested in that at all. I think that's silly. It's not about always being happy or always being, in the sound of music, dancing and singing or something. It's, but it also means that you're trying to not come from a reactivity place, no matter what emotions you're having or activities you're involved in. You're coming from response and the unfolding moment in a non-reactive manner. So it doesn't have to look pretty. It can look real non-pretty. But on the other hand, if, for example, you are you consider yourself to have gotten the awakening you want, and now you're going to go off and work on skiing again, which I think is great. Check out how you are behaving with your partner. Check out how you're behaving in your work life. Check out how you treat a waiter or waitress. Check out, how your manifestation is happening in the world. How much of that is, again, it's not about whether you're getting angry or sad or whatever, because I think if you maintain your humanity at all, you're going to be angry and sad sometimes. No, in my opinion, no part of awakening says you're supposed to have certain emotions and not have other emotions. But are you really always coming from the place that you want to be coming from in your interactions with other human beings and with animals and with all life? And, really being serious with yourself about that. I see there's so many possibilities for spiritual bypassing on these points. Just for very human reasons, people use those spiritual bypass techniques to get out of working on their stuff. And again, I don't think that's a crime or some kind of sin. It's just that's the kind of thing that, for me, I believe that people need to be working on forever. And as I described, it's the case that when you think that you have no more growth to do, that you're going to start really running into problems. I mean, without mentioning any names, I was very aware and closely associated in certain teaching ways with, one of the most enlightened masters on the face of the earth, a Buddhist master who was obviously a master's master in the art of meditating, and yet was sexually molesting all his female students, and had been doing that for, let's say, like 40 years. And the other students were just letting that happen and hiding it from other people. That's what you get when you start thinking there are perfect masters. I mean, obvious bad behavior that just needs to get rooted out, that needs to be fixed. Mm-hmm. And all that's keeping that person from fixing that is the belief that it doesn't need to be fixed because they're perfect. And that once they stop getting feedback from their students, like, or peers, like, hey, you need to cut this out. Once that kind of feedback stops, then the wheels come off.
When you said peers, I couldn't help but think of the peer review process. Perhaps that's what's needed.
That's right. And not just peer review to like test whether you actually have awakening, but which is interesting, but in a way not even the point. The peer review is more about, are you behaving badly as a teacher? Are you using your position to get power or over people, or to use them sexually, or to enrich yourself in sort of a way where your greed is out of control? Like the 20 Cadillacs version of spirituality. Mm-hmm. These are the kind of things we need a real peer review process on, so that people don't lose the feedback that they need to function properly. Mm-hmm. We are social animals who evolve to work together in a group, and we need continuous feedback from others to behave properly. If you check out the situation of various dictators who have lasted for a long time, like decades as dictator, they end up being very strange people, extremely strange. And I just don't believe that they started out that weird. They may have been a sociopath or whatever, but it's the fact that for 20, 30, 40 years, everyone is so afraid of them that they just say anything that they do is great. Oh, yes, that's great. And when that's all the feedback you get from every person around you for your whole adult life, you start getting very strange, because people need the feedback of other people.
Well, I would like to talk to you a little bit about some of the nitty-gritty of meditation. And I'm especially interested in what you call the process of deconstructing the ego. And first off, could you just tell me, how do you define ego?
Yeah, that's that's the important question. So, in this case, I would say that just in a very ballparking kind of way, the ego is the ego is a construction of thoughts and feelings. Okay, that's it. Obviously, that's not a full definition, but that's close enough. And it's a kind of avatar that one uses in one's head to plan. The brain is evolved essentially as a planning device. It's a prediction machine. You're going to predict and plan how to get food, how to get shelter, how to find a mate, and all this stuff. And as part of the visioning process for what you're going to do next, you have a mental construction in your mind of you going and doing that stuff. You have this imaginary avatar in your head of the you that goes and does things, or the you that in memory went and did things in the past. And it's very much like if you play on your Xbox or PlayStation, some kind of first-person shooter, that person on the screen that is made just of photons, but it's a three-dimensional representation of you on the screen that's going and doing stuff. It's very similar to that, but it's made of, again, not to put too fine a point on it, it's made of thoughts and feelings. And we need egos to function properly in the world. They're not imaginary or bad. You absolutely require one. But in order to have some level of awakening, it's extremely important to understand that that's not you. And there's a lot of different techniques to get to the place where a human being understands that ego avatar, that mental construction of themselves, isn't actually themselves. It's one thing to know that intellectually, and another one to experience that.
Right. I have known people who can say, and I believe experientially, that, okay, I can see thoughts moving through my mind. Maybe they're pictures, words, whatever. I can see that. I can see feeling come up. I can see how that is a thing separate. But it's still a thing separate from me. There's still a me, an observer, perhaps you could call it, a witness. I think some people use that term. Do you find people coming to that same place in your meditation, and how do you advise them to get past what I think may be a block of coming to a sense of, yes, I am the meditator who's observing these things, but I can't get past that. I've deconstructed myself to a degree, it seems like, but there's still a very firm sense of I'm a person, I'm an individual who's meditating.
Yeah, that's a very common pitfall, or I call it a failure mode. It's a common failure mode, especially in Vipassana meditation, mindfulness meditation, where, the instructions are to become an observer. Mm-hmm. People get really, really, really good at being an observer, and there's nothing wrong with that. You get a handle on life, and stuff doesn't bother you as much, and you're behaving much better to your fellow beings. But as you said, you can still, even though you're getting a lot of mileage out of your practice, you're still not getting that awakening. And there's a very good reason for that, and it's actually a real known failure mode of Vipassana. It's one of the ways that Vipassana is critiqued often by other Buddhist traditions, is that in the end, you're building, and you even kind of said this in your question, you're building sort of a meditator. You're building a witness. And as long as that meditator or that witness remains outside the meditation, it remains unexamined. And so there will always be this ego of the meditator or ego of the witness that is doing the practice. And so let's say you've got a handle on 99% of your ego activity through this witness. Again, that's really good. But as long as there's this tiny little bit of ego being the meditator, of ego being the witness, it's still completely unawake. And so the trick is to understand that that meditator ego is not some kind of special intangible bad thing. It's just some other thoughts and feelings. It's thoughts about doing the meditation. It's body sensations about being a meditator. It's mental images about what you're doing as you're meditating. And so the cure for this is from this way of working. There is a Vipassana way of overcoming this pitfall of Vipassana, and that is to just take the same exact method that you are using on the rest of your ego, that is deconstructing the thoughts and feelings, and you turn it back around on that meditator and deconstruct the thoughts and feelings of being the meditator. And, my favorite story of this is from Ken Wilber, who was sitting in a Zen retreat, a Zen retreat, and had gone very, very deep and was talking about his witness experiences. And in a very Zen way, the teacher said, the witness is the last refuge of the ego. And Wilber, I think, more or less recognized that suddenly and kind of had a major awakening from that instruction. And that's what that teacher was saying. Hey, you got to look at this witness person, this meditator person, and deconstruct that. And once that's deconstructed, then suddenly, boom, you're awake. So that's what with this particular failure mode, with this particular aspect of Vipassana, which happens a lot, that is the way out. That at least the way out that still uses Vipassana, right? There's other ways out, but that's it's a very interesting thing that happens to a lot of people, and it's very predictable. And what I find sad sometimes is how many mindfulness or Vipassana traditions, well, let me put it another way. I see people who've been practicing Vipassana for decades who never get the instruction of how to get out of that cul-de-sac, and it's really actually quite easy. So it's sort of, a shame that not more people are aware of how to get out of this trap. It's called the observer trap.
Well, let me dig a little bit deeper into that, because this is something that I was definitely stuck in. And in one of your talks, you used the phrase "a hall of mirrors," and I really related to that because the observer watching the observer, watching the observer, watching the observer, on and on and on. And it definitely felt like a trap or a dead end of yes, I can see myself observing, but I literally experienced that as yet another observer who just noticed that there's observation going on. I don't know if you call that the tenacity of the ego or what, but just now when you said, well, there's actually a very simple way out of this, you mentioned explaining to someone intellectually that, well, this is what's going on. And you mentioned the example of Wilbur, who had sort of perhaps an intuitive grasp or an insight that sprang upon him. Is that what has to happen? An aha moment? Or is there something more that can be said about how to get out of that?
I'll try to talk about it in another way.
Okay.
That might shed some light. This idea of the Hall of Mirrors, that there's sort of an observer watching an observer watching an observer. And when you think about it, that's a spatial metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
And it means that there's an observer over here looking at something over there. And then there's another observer somewhere else looking at that thing over here. And it's like a physical spatial metaphor. You're trying to find a place where the observer is sitting in space, or where the final awareness, who's not an ego, is located. And so that's a spatial metaphor. And I think that it's that metaphor that's the issue. Because really, this is more happening on a temporal plane. It's more time-based. So you'll notice that you're witnessing something, and then there arises this sense of, so let's say you're witnessing something that's thoughts and feelings of ego, and then you'll notice that there was the ego of the meditator observing that. Well, that took some time. That's, in fact, the next thing that arose. And then, as you keep looking, there will be the next thing that arises. And then there's the next thing that arises. And these, it's almost like these waves of thought and feeling that are the next observer, and then another wave that's the next observer. Or another way to describe this is there's the thoughts and feelings of the thing that the observer is looking at, and then there's the reaction to that, and the reaction to that is the next thought and feeling observer, and then the reaction to that is the next thought and feeling observer. And it's like this wave that's just continuing in time, not in space. And so if you understand that egos aren't these like fixed structures that are just sitting there and you're trying to find place in space to put them, that metaphor just doesn't work. Instead, it's like they are these waves, these coming together of reaction in thoughts and feelings. And you see that it's just the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one. And what you understand is that there's always going to be the next reaction. There's always going to be the next reaction. And you understand that that's not ever you, none of those reactions. So I think it's this attempt to put things in physical space, to locate these different observers, that ends up being sort of the Hall of Mirrors problem. And that my solution to the Hall of Mirrors is that it's not a Hall of Mirrors. It's simply a continuously rotating, unfolding thing in time. And that it's just the next reaction is the next thought and feeling, ego arising. The next reaction is the next thought and feeling, ego arising. And by just observing that over and over and over, it becomes stunningly clear that none of those is the like, quote, real position. Now, that doesn't mean somehow no thoughts and feelings are going to arise.
Sure.
And it doesn't mean that you might not even grab onto some of those thoughts and feelings as a identity. But you get the sense that you're, instead of stuck on a branch, so to speak, and observing from this special place, that instead you're swinging from branch to branch, and none of those branches is a special place. And at that point, there's this opportunity, and it might just be an insight to just let go of the next branch. And it feels like, for many people, it feels like you're falling through space. Mm-hmm. And so they avoid that, but actually you kind of want that kind of disorientation or falling through space that comes from not grabbing on to the next thought and feeling identity that arises. Mm-hmm. And instead just let that arise. And that's when it completely dissolves, and you're not trying to land on any one of those identities. The whole trouble with the way that people talk about it is they think they're going to find a place to land as this
right
non-dual witness.
Sure.
And the only place to land is in thoughts and feelings. So they're just trying to find this more and more simple, expansive, peaceful thoughts and feelings. And that's a totally false direction. The direction is to not land anywhere.
Your examples from your life have shown that's not always the best thing, to just do what the teacher tells you to do. That you need to have some sense of inner guidance, perhaps. And I'm wondering if you feel like, is there an intuition that's separate from thought and feeling, or is intuition just a refined feeling? Do you have any sense of being guided through life?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that probably more than being guided by intuition in a lot of these decisions, I was just guided by my personality, which is kind of an asshole, and who refuses to believe something just because somebody told me. I can, in certain ways, I'm very skeptical and I'm just naturally or psychologically drawn towards the exceptions and all the ways it's not true, and the thing that they're hiding and the thing that they won't talk about, and that's just where my mind goes. And so it kind of just whatever the sort of default personality structure that arises has that sort of dickish, skeptical thing. And I think that in many ways that's helped me a lot. So there's that. It's just simple.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I do think that intuition is obviously available. I mean, I can talk about it in many different ways, but I'll just go from a more sciencey perspective, and say that, there's many, many, many simultaneous parallel streams of processing going on in the brain, like thousands and thousands of unconscious processes or networks firing in your brain. You can see the images they've generated of a person's brain working, and there's a lot going on at any one time. Yeah. And one of the things that meditation does is makes available some of these lower levels of parallel processing that were not available before you were meditating. And so there's some very cool science about this where they have people draw cards and they get money if the cards are good, and they get money taken from them if the cards are bad. I'm butchering this experiment because I want to describe it quickly. But the point is, and then they hook these people up to a stress machine as they're doing it. And the point is that eventually people just figure out that some of these decks are bad. Like the researchers actually made some of them non-random, and they were going to lose money picking from that deck. And on average, it took them 40 draws to finally realize, oh, I'm not going to use that deck anymore. But based on the readings from the stress machine that they were hooked up to, they started experiencing stress when they drew from the bad decks after only 10 tries.
Right.
So it's that gap between some part of their deep unconscious knowing those decks were bad, which happened after only 10 tries, to that material filtering up to their conscious awareness so that they would stop drawing from those decks, which was after 40 tries. That 30 round gap is something that we can make much, much, much smaller through meditation, so that as you get more and more sensitive to your own body sensations, your thoughts and feelings, you might notice even on that 10th try when you start feeling stress, like, oh, that's a non-random deck. That's bad. I'm not going to draw from that anymore. To me, that level of intuition is cultivatable through meditation. It's very predictable that you will get better. You know, the insula structure in your brain gets much, much, much larger from doing mindfulness meditation. The insula is what allows you to have interoception, which means feeling your own internal sensations. So it just makes sense that you get better at feeling these very subtle emotions of stress, or thoughts and feelings of stress around things that your unconscious has been aware of that you have not consciously been paying attention to. So to me, that kind of intuition, sort of opening up to the massive parallel processing of the deep mind, is one of the results of meditation and is available to you. So yeah, I think it's really helped my intuition a lot. That being said, you know, in my life, intuition or gut feelings or whatever have always been a major guide. I've taken enormous decisions just based on my intuition about them. And sometimes that's been good and sometimes that's been not so good, but that's always been a source of real guidance for me.
Yeah.
So.
One quick question and then we'll wrap up. Is there a book that you recommend most often to people?
The Mindful Geek.
I'm not familiar with this book.
Yeah, I mean, of course. To me, that's like, okay, here's a bunch of stuff I have to say about meditation, all, wrapped up in a nice package with a neat bow. But I assume that's not what you were asking.
No, that's actually, other people have said that. And if that is the one, good. Yeah. Although we could ask if there's a runner-up book.
My favorite spiritual book really is I Am That by Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj.
Oh, I didn't know that you were interested in him.
Oh, of course. That's a spiritual classic. And, especially when I was involved in, let's say, a more theological version of spirituality, the book was really hard for me to understand. I read it over and over and over, and I could feel the awakening that he was speaking from, and I was very interested, but I just couldn't get it. But since I've been coming from a more naturalistic and I'll say maybe not science-based, but science-y perspective, the book just gets easier and easier and easier to understand. I feel like things that Sri Nisargadatta is saying in that book, I previously took as a metaphor. And it's taken me a long time to realize he's not making a metaphor. He's talking about his direct experience. And that's made the book come alive for me again after all these years. It's really rare that a book will become more and more alive in the information way, in the teaching way, after decades and decades. But this is one that does.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that book and recommend it often.
Okay. So you have your book, The Mindful Geek, which I have a copy of in front of me right here. What else are you involved in, and where should people go to learn more about you?
So I'm doing a lot of teaching. I have classes and retreats. I've got a online mindfulness of emotions class that I'm extremely interested in and happy about. It's called Mindful Emotions Training. If you want to find that or get a free electronic copy of the Mindful Geek book, or want to listen to a bunch of guided meditations by me, that's all available at themindfulgeek.com. And then most of my blog posts, hundreds of articles on various aspects of spirituality by me and also by my friend Jessica Graham, those are available on the blog called deconstructingyourself.com. So those are just a few ways. And almost all of this stuff is free. The blogs are free. There's no advertising on the site. The guided meditations are free. I teach classes in the Bay Area that are free. There's a little bit of stuff on a YouTube channel. And then the Mindful Emotions class, the online course, is paid. So there's really a huge number of ways to connect with the stuff I'm talking about.
Nice. Thank you, Michael.